Welcome to this tutorial for the FlightSim Studios Embraer E-Jet 175 for MSFS. This video covers the currently available early access version of the plane when the full version is released. I will of course cover it because it should have much more complex functionality. Right now this uses a lot of the default flight planning and autopilot in MSFS. Okay, we're at a runway start with engines on. Let's head down to the FMC and we'll go across to the flight planning page. If we click on route and then go to the next page, we'll be able to see the route that we've already set in the world map in the flight simulator. We'll head back through the menus and we'll now go to the perf page and start setting up the airplane performance. Now some of this is still not finished, but we can at least set our takeoff and landing fuel. We'll set 500/600 as per the documentation in the plane. This tends to be the average amount that this aircraft will use for these phases of flight. If we hit next, we'll now be given the option to set our cruising altitude, so that's 26,000 feet for this short flight. As for the cruise wind, the EFB on this plane is not finished yet. It's incredibly difficult to find that information, so we'll leave it as default. But what we can find in the EFB is our zero fuel weight. So we'll enter that, and that is 27,250 kilos. You can see this also updates our gross weight. On the next page, again, this isn't finished yet. So heading back to the performance main menu, we'll now head over to the departure limit page. This is where our initial speed is shown, so that's V2 plus 10. We'll leave that as it is, and that's the speed the plane will initially target. These speeds are currently empty, but that's cool because we'll go to the takeoff initialize page, and all we need to enter is some information about our runway. So the winds at the current runway, again, there's no information in the EFB, but you can actually get it from the PFD. So it's currently 27 knots from 21 degrees. We'll enter that here. Obviously you should always take off facing into the winds, but it changed between me planning the flight and starting the flight, so let's just go with that for now. On the next page we've got flaps 2 set. This is by default, this is correct. The rest of the page is not finished yet. Now we'll see that our takeoff speeds, our V speeds, have been populated since our weights are complete and we've entered the takeoff winds. The climb page, again mostly unfinished, but our top of climb altitude is pulled through from when we entered our cruising altitude. We'll also enter the transition altitude in the country we're flying in the UK, that's 5,000 feet. Cruise page, again, essentially unfinished, but it shows our correct cruising altitude. Descent page, again, largely unfinished, but the transition altitude, again, we'll set that to 5,000 feet for this phase. So we can now go back to the flight plan page. Our flight plan is in there, we're all good. One last step is to set our destination ILS. So we'll pop that into the nav1 radio position. So before we take off, we'll set the auto brake to RTO. We'll also hit B to set the correct altimeter, the local pressure. Okay, we'll now switch on the flight director. It doesn't light up, but it does work. We'll also activate nav mode or LNAV, which is the same. It doesn't light up, but it does activate. You've got an annunciator there on the PFD. So we'll also set our cruising altitude using the altitude knob. This is a mouse wheel or drag control. We'll set that to our desired cruising altitude of 26,000 feet. Okay, it's now time for takeoff. So park and brake off and throttles to full. You rotate at your VR speed. It's kind of difficult to see the screens, but you may have to zoom in. So landing gear up just after takeoff, and when you reach around 400 feet, activate the autopilot. Initially it goes into flight path attitude hold, but we'll switch that over to flight level change mode. So the airplane will now alter its pitch to keep its current speed and head towards your target altitude. So as we saw in the FMC, the initial set speed is V2 plus 10. We'll use the airspeed knob, which is again a mouse wheel or drag control, to set 250 knots below 10,000 feet. Above your transition altitude, click the barometer set knob to set the altimeter to standard pressure. So once you're above 10,000 feet, you'll see we're at 250 knots, which we set earlier. We can now increase that towards our desired cruising speed. So again, using the airspeed knob, I'm going to set that to 320 knots, This will vary based on your weight and your flight plan. Make sure you're below the overspeed barber pole as shown here. As you reach your top of climb, you'll see an altitude annunciator on the PFD and the airplane will begin to level off. At cruise, I like to activate the auto throttle so you don't have to manually manage it or worry about overspeed. Here's a quick overview of the annunciators you should expect at cruise. You can see speed, autopilot, auto throttle, LNAV and altitude. So we can now start preparing for some of our descent. If we go over to the landing page under performance, we'll need to set a few things here. First of all, we'll set the runway heading. I find this on apxp.info. We'll also need to set some information about the weather and our destination. I find this on aviationweather.gov, so it's 8 degrees at Glasgow and the winds are at 250 degrees and 17 knots, so we'll get those entered. If we now go over to the landing page, you'll see we've been given our V-speeds for landing. Continuing our prep, we're going to set the autobrake to medium and we'll also set our bottom of descent altitude on the MCP even though we're not descending yet. This is generally 2,000 feet above the airport elevation. So at Glasgow we're setting 3,000 feet. ATC will give you a descent call because there's no VNAV in this plane, so when they do, just hit flight level change. The plane will idle the throttles and begin to descend to your desired bottom of descent altitude. Just before you pass through 10,000 feet, set that airspeed to 250 knots. Now it's possible with this plane the ATC may direct you to descend a little bit late. If that happens, just push heading sync and activate heading mode. The plane will continue on its current heading to give you time to descend and decelerate before approach. Of course, as you pass through transition altitude on the way down, click that barometer set knob and hit B for local pressure. So at bottom of descent, you'll see the altitude annunciator light again, and it's now time to slow to your approach speed or your VAP speed that's shown in the FMC. That's 123 knots for us today. As the airplane decelerates, use the flap extended speed guide to the left of the PFD to guide you as to when to apply the flaps as you decelerate. And of course, once you reach your approach speed, full flaps and landing gear down. It's now time to adjust the heading knob, which again is mouse wheel or drag, to vector yourself back towards the airport. As you head back towards the airport, it may be useful to reactivate LNAV mode to keep you on course. When getting close to the airport, set navigation source to VLR localizer. Also, set your course using the course knob. This will appear on the PFD to the left. Make sure it matches the one you entered in the FMC earlier. You can now activate approach mode. You'll see localizer and glide slope annunciators armed. Unfortunately, the approach mode in this plane is very unfinished and it does have difficulty intercepting the localizer. You can see here we are literally pointing at the runway, and yet localizer and glide slope modes are still armed and not active. If that happens, no problem, just disengage autopilot and follow the localizer and glide slope data on the PFD manually. And you can see here, following that data for glide slope and localizer deviation, we're in a nice stable approach. As we get close to the runway, we will toggle the auto throttle off using the button on the MCP because hotkeys don't seem to work yet, and we'll bring the throttles back to idle. Now this plane is really very floaty, so make sure you don't overflare it. Okay, and that concludes our successful tutorial flight in the FlightSim Studio Embraer 175. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this useful, please drop a like, feel free to subscribe, all that good stuff. Take care, and I'll see you next time.